History is not written by the strongest nations, but by the boldest moves. There are moments when a single decision changes global power equations forever. Today I will take you through a story where India, once underestimated, made a move so daring that it shook the mighty United States and proved to the world that true strength lies not in size but in courage and conviction. In the early years of its independence, India was often dismissed on the world stage as a fragile nation, struggling with poverty, political instability, and the challenges of building an economy from scratch. Many global powers, particularly the United States, saw India as a developing country with limited influence, incapable of standing up against the established giants of the world order. The perception was that India would always remain dependent, always cautious, and never daring enough to challenge the authority of the superpowers. This image of India as an underestimated nation was not just an international belief, but also a narrative that many Indians themselves had to struggle against. There was an assumption that India lacked the willpower and strategic boldness to carve its own independent path when faced with pressure from powerful nations. But history has shown us that true strength is often hidden beneath layers of struggle, and underestimated nations can rise when the moment demands it. India, despite being counted out, carried within itself a reservoir of resilience and determination. The world saw poverty, but what it failed to see was the unbreakable spirit of a civilization that had survived invasions, colonization, and centuries of exploitation. The same world that dismissed India as weak did not recognize the deep-rooted desire of its people and its leaders to prove that independence was not just symbolic, but also strategic. India was ready to show that it would not bow to pressure or align blindly with anyone. It would forge its own destiny. When the United States underestimated India, it was largely because of a misjudgment of character and resolve. To America, India seemed too focused on its internal struggles to take bold steps on the global stage. In Washington's eyes, nations like the Soviet Union and China were worthy rivals, while India was a country still finding its footing. This underestimation created a blind spot, and that blind spot became India's strength. India understood that being overlooked gave it an opportunity to prepare quietly, to build its capabilities without drawing too much attention, and to plan a move that would force the world to sit up and take notice. The underestimated nation did not stay silent forever. Beneath the surface, India was cultivating not just technological progress, but also political will. Its leaders were aware that respect in the global arena is never given freely. It is earned through decisive action. And while others dismissed India as a land of poverty and bureaucracy, India was slowly setting the stage for a move that would rewrite the rules of power dynamics. This move was not born out of arrogance, but out of necessity. It was about dignity, about self-respect, and about sending a message to the world that India was not a follower, it was a force waiting to be acknowledged. The rise of an underestimated nation is always a story of surprise, because it disrupts the expectations of those who thought they had control. In India's case, this rise was not about sudden aggression or reckless action, but about a carefully calculated decision that showed the depth of its courage. The humiliation of the United States did not come simply from India's action, but from the realization that America had never truly understood India's potential in the first place. The bold move that shocked the world did not emerge out of impulse or reckless ambition. It was the result of calculated resolve and the recognition that there comes a time when silence is no longer an option. For decades, India had been pressured, lectured, and even threatened by world powers whenever it showed signs of asserting its independence in matters of security and sovereignty. The United States in particular often believed that through economic pressure, diplomatic posturing, or promises of aid, it could dictate India's choices. Yet India reached a moment in history when it decided to take a stand, fully aware that its action would invite outrage, condemnation, and even sanctions from the most powerful nation in the world. That act of defiance, however, was what transformed the way India was perceived globally. The move itself was daring because it went against the grain of expectation. When nations in the developing world were expected to obey the unspoken rules laid out by the superpowers, India chose to act differently. It carried out a decision that demonstrated not only technological capability but also political courage. The sheer audacity of this act shocked the world because it came from a country that had long been typecast as cautious, hesitant, and too concerned about external approval. Instead, India broke free from that mold and declared, through its action, that its destiny would not be shaped by the approval of others. This sudden shift rattled the existing balance of power because it was not just about what India did, but about the message behind it. India would no longer be dictated to. The boldness of the move lay in its timing and execution. It was carried out in a manner that made it impossible for anyone to dismiss as symbolic or insignificant. The world could no longer ignore India's determination, and the United States in particular was caught unprepared. America had underestimated India's resolve and was suddenly forced into a position where its influence seemed weakened. For a superpower that prided itself on controlling the global narrative, this was nothing short of a humiliation. The United States was forced to acknowledge that its usual methods of pressure and persuasion had failed, and that India had managed to challenge its dominance not through words but through action. What made this move even more powerful was that it was not just about challenging America, but about sending a signal to the entire world. India was demonstrating that sovereignty meant the ability to make decisions without seeking permission. Other nations, especially those in the developing world, looked at India with newfound respect. Here was a country that had taken a risk most others would have avoided, and in doing so, it had forced the global stage to be redefined. The shock was not only in the act itself, but in the realization that the world order could no longer ignore India's boldness. It was proof that courage, when combined with conviction, could shake even the most established powers. Why the U.S. was caught off guard lies in the very way it had been viewing India for decades. In the eyes of American policymakers, India was never seen as a country that would defy international expectations in such a dramatic fashion. The United States believed that India's economic struggles, dependence on foreign aid, and cautious diplomacy would always prevent it from taking actions that could disrupt the global balance of power. To Washington, India was important but not threatening, influential but not daring, and certainly not capable of standing up to American pressure. This miscalculation created a dangerous assumption that India would remain predictable, and when India made its bold move, the U.S. was left stunned because it had never considered such defiance a real possibility. Part of the reason the U.S. was blindsided was rooted in its own arrogance as a superpower. America was used to dictating terms to smaller nations and seeing them comply, whether through promises of economic aid, strategic alliances, or veiled threats of sanctions. It had successfully exercised this influence in many parts of the world, and it expected India to be no different. But what Washington failed to recognize was that India's sense of sovereignty ran deeper than any external pressure. Unlike many other nations, India had been through the trauma of colonization and was unwilling to trade away its independence for temporary favors. This deep cultural and historical resolve was something America overlooked, and it became the very reason for its humiliation. Another reason for the U.S. being caught off guard was its overconfidence in intelligence and diplomacy. American agencies and diplomats prided themselves on predicting the moves of other countries, but in this case, India managed to keep its intentions tightly guarded. The meticulous secrecy with which India prepared its action meant that by the time the U.S. realized what was happening, it was already too late. This lack of foresight was a shock to Washington, which had always believed that no major international move could happen without its knowledge or influence. India proved otherwise, and that revelation shook the foundations of America's perceived dominance. The geopolitical environment also played a role in America's surprise. The U.S. was heavily invested in its rivalry with the Soviet Union and was focused on containing China's rise. In this context, India was seen as a secondary player, a country struggling to find its place rather than one capable of challenging American authority. This misplacement of priorities meant that when India acted decisively, it disrupted not just U.S. policy but also the global strategy America had been pursuing. Suddenly, India was no longer a background participant in global affairs. It was a central player that had forced the U.S. to react. Perhaps the most striking element of America's shock was the realization that its usual tools of control had failed. Economic threats, diplomatic warnings, and international pressure had all been brushed aside by India. The U.S. had relied too heavily on the assumption that fear of isolation or sanctions would keep India in line, but instead, India displayed a level of self-confidence that America was not prepared to face. The humiliation did not only stem from India's bold action, but also from the undeniable truth that the world's most powerful nation had completely misjudged India's willpower and capacity for defiance. The ripple effect across global powers was immediate and far-reaching, because when one nation dares to defy the established order, it does not just alter its own destiny, it shifts the psychology of international relations. India's bold move sent shockwaves not only through Washington, but also across capitals in Europe, Asia, and beyond. Nations that had long seen India as a passive player suddenly realized they were dealing with a country willing to take risks, a country prepared to stake its claim to sovereignty, even at the cost of angering the most powerful nation in the world. This unexpected demonstration of courage forced governments everywhere to reevaluate their assumptions about India and to reconsider the balance of power in the global arena. For the United States, the ripple effect was particularly painful because it weakened the aura of absolute control it had enjoyed in the post-war world. If India, a developing nation still finding its economic footing, could openly challenge American pressure and withstand its reaction, then what message did that send to other countries that had quietly resented U.S. dominance? Smaller nations began to feel that resistance was possible, that the dictates of the superpowers were not invincible. India had unintentionally emboldened others by proving that sovereignty was not just a word but a stance that could be defended with action.
The psychological blow to American authority was as significant as the practical one, because it punctured the myth of unchallenged supremacy. On the other hand, rival powers like the Soviet Union saw India's move as a strategic victory, not necessarily because India aligned itself fully with them, but because it demonstrated cracks in the American shield of influence. For Moscow, India's defiance was evidence that U.S. dominance could be resisted, and it opened the door for stronger ties with nations looking for alternatives to Washington's authority. The ripple was not just political but ideological. The Cold War was built on the idea of two dominant blocs, but India's actions signaled the rise of an independent voice that refused to be boxed into either camp. This emboldened the concept of non-alignment and gave momentum to countries searching for a third path in world politics. China, too, watched with keen interest. Although Beijing had its own complicated relationship with India, it could not ignore the significance of India asserting itself in a way that directly undermined U.S. authority. For China, the move was a reminder that Asia was no longer a passive theater for superpower rivalry, but a region where nations could chart their own course. This realization altered calculations across the continent, as Asian nations began to sense that they had more room to maneuver than previously assumed. In Europe, allies of the United States were unsettled by the boldness of India's decision. Nations that had aligned themselves with Washington began to question whether America's grip on the international system was as strong as it claimed. Some saw India's move as reckless, but many quietly admired the courage it took to stand against overwhelming pressure. The ripple effect here was subtle but important. It exposed the fragility of alliances built solely on fear of American dominance, and highlighted the possibility of a more multipolar world. The developing world, perhaps more than any other region, felt the strongest surge of inspiration. Countries in Africa, the Middle East and Latin America, many of which had suffered under colonialism or were struggling with dependency on larger powers, looked at India's defiance as a beacon of hope. If India could withstand the fury of the United States and still stand tall, then perhaps they too could reclaim their own dignity. The ripple effect, therefore, was not just about politics or military power, but about confidence. The confidence that courage could change the narrative of history. India's lesson in self-belief came from centuries of struggle, where the nation was often told it was not strong enough, not advanced enough, and not ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of the world. Colonial rule had left behind not just economic scars but also psychological ones, where even after independence, many doubted whether India could survive as a democracy, let alone assert itself on the global stage. Yet the moment India chose to make a bold move, it was not just about strategy or politics. It was a profound declaration of self-confidence. It was a reminder to its own people and to the world that true strength comes not from external approval, but from the conviction that one's path is justified, necessary, and worth defending. Self-belief in India's case was not built overnight. It grew from the sacrifices of leaders who had fought for freedom, from the resilience of citizens who endured poverty and hardship, and from the vision of thinkers who insisted that India was destined for more than survival. For decades, India had balanced between caution and ambition, aware of its vulnerabilities but also aware of its potential. When the time came to act decisively, it was this inner reservoir of confidence that allowed the nation to stand firm against the inevitable backlash. The lesson was clear. No nation earns respect by waiting for validation. Respect is earned by demonstrating that one's sovereignty is non-negotiable. The United States, in its reaction, unintentionally amplified this lesson for India. By condemning India's action, threatening sanctions, and attempting to isolate it diplomatically, America tested the limits of India's resolve. Instead of breaking under pressure, India stood taller, proving to itself that it did not need constant Western approval to define its future. This strengthened the psychological backbone of the nation, embedding the belief that courage carries a power far greater than fear of consequences. Every nation faces moments of doubt, but what India showed was that stepping forward with conviction can change how both allies and rivals perceive you. For the Indian people, the bold move became more than just a political or military decision. It was a source of pride, an affirmation that their nation was capable of great things. In villages and cities alike, there was a newfound sense of confidence, a belief that India was not destined to remain in the shadows, but had the right to command its own place on the world stage. This internal shift was as important as the external recognition, because it fueled a generation with the understanding that limitations are often illusions created by others. The lesson in self-belief also extended to how India saw its future role in global affairs. No longer content with being a silent participant, India realized that it had the moral and strategic authority to speak and act independently. The experience proved that defiance of pressure, when rooted in principle, could lead to greater respect rather than isolation. It was a transformation of mindset, one where India stopped asking whether it was ready, and instead declared through its actions that it had always been ready, waiting only for the courage to be expressed. India's lesson in self-belief was forged in an environment where the odds were stacked against it, where external powers constantly doubted its capability, and where internal struggles often made progress seem painfully slow. For decades after independence, the country was viewed through the narrow lens of poverty, instability, and dependency, and this perception created a global narrative that India was too weak to take risks risks or shape global outcomes. Yet, when the bold move was made, it shattered those assumptions and sent a message to both the world and to India itself that strength is not measured by wealth or military size alone, but by the conviction to act when action is necessary. The real transformation happened in the minds of Indians, who began to see their nation not as a follower, but as a force of destiny. The foundation of this self-belief came from India's long history of resilience. Centuries of invasions, colonial exploitation, and systemic suppression had created a deep well of endurance in the Indian spirit. Even in the harshest conditions, the people had preserved their culture, their identity, and their vision of freedom. After independence, the same endurance turned into a quiet determination to build and progress, though often in the shadow of skepticism from powerful nations. When India finally stood up with a bold, uncompromising move, it was drawing from that reservoir of resilience, proving that self-belief had always been there, waiting for the right moment to erupt onto the world stage. The confrontation with the United States further cemented this lesson. America had expected India to bend under pressure, to hesitate in the face of economic threats, or to retreat under diplomatic isolation. Instead, India stood firm, sending a clear signal that its decisions would not be dictated by external approval. This was more than just defiance. It was the awakening of a mindset that had been underestimated for too long. By holding its ground against the strongest power in the world, India discovered that it was not weakness that defined it, but the courage to say no when its sovereignty was at stake. This defiance in itself became a source of pride and a foundation of confidence for the future. For ordinary citizens, the bold move became a symbol of empowerment. It reminded them that the struggle for independence had not been in vain, and that the sacrifices of earlier generations were bearing fruit in the form of a nation capable of standing tall. The pride that swept through the country was not just about the immediate action, but about the deeper realization that India had within itself the ability to shape history. This surge of confidence filtered into every corner of society, inspiring individuals to see their own potential as part of a larger national story of resilience and progress. The international response also reinforced India's self-belief. While condemnation came from some quarters, respect came from others, especially from nations that had long been waiting for someone to challenge the dominance of superpowers. India realized that acting with courage did not mean isolation, but rather a redefinition of its place in the world. This recognition strengthened the idea that belief in one's own strength can open doors that hesitation keeps closed. In standing tall, India discovered that true power begins with the refusal to doubt oneself, no matter how overwhelming the opposition may appear. How boldness creates legacy can be seen most clearly in the way India's decisive move echoed far beyond the moment it was made. History does not remember nations for their caution, it remembers them for their courage. When India defied the expectations of the world and stood up to the United States, it did something far greater than simply make a political statement. It carved out a place in history where the nation could no longer be ignored, and that impact became a permanent part of its legacy. Boldness, in this case, was not reckless. It was a carefully measured risk taken with the awareness that the consequences could be harsh. Yet by choosing courage over fear, India transformed how it was perceived, how its people viewed themselves, and how the future generations would inherit their sense of national pride. Legacy is never built in silence. Nations that achieve greatness are those that make choices that seem impossible, those that dare to act when everyone expects them to stay quiet. India's bold step became a defining chapter not only in its own history but in the history of global power dynamics. It showed that even in an unequal world where some countries appeared invincible, it was possible to challenge authority and still stand tall. That act of daring did not fade with time. It became a symbol that continued to inspire long after the immediate consequences had passed. The boldness was not temporary, but lasting, because it proved a principle. Respect comes not from compliance but from conviction. For the Indian people, this legacy was deeply personal. It gave them a story of triumph against overwhelming odds, a moment they could look back on with pride and draw strength from. Each generation that followed was able to point to that bold decision as proof that India was not destined to be underestimated or sidelined. The lesson was passed down that courage is not just about armies or weapons, but about the will to act in defense of one's dignity. This created a cultural memory, a reminder that whenever India faced adversity, it had already proven its ability to rise above fear. Internationally, the boldness reshaped how India was engaged by other powers. Nations that once dismissed it as a secondary player were forced to factor it into their strategies and policies. This changed the trajectory of India's diplomatic and strategic role, giving it influence far greater than what numbers alone could justify. Legacy in this sense meant that India was no longer just reacting to world events, it was actively shaping them. The move stood as a turning point, a marker that future historians would highlight when speaking of how global power structures shifted. The most profound element of this legacy, however, was its inspirational power. Boldness has a ripple effect that extends beyond borders, and India's action became a guiding light for other countries seeking to assert their independence. It showed that courage can outlast criticism, that conviction can outweigh opposition, and that once a nation proves its strength through bold action, it leaves behind a legacy that cannot be erased.